Welcome, everyone, to another Historical Materialism broadcast. This event is part of a series of live events that we've been running with authors. Welcome, everyone, to another Historical Materialism broadcast. That was my bad. This is part of a series of events that we're running with authors of new books in the HM book series. You can find past events on the YouTube playlist. And to hear about upcoming book talks, I've also posted a link to the HM webpage in the chat where you can find out more about the journal and also subscribe to our mailing list. So today we're here to talk about the book, The Narrowest Path, Antinomies of Self-Determination in Four Aesthetic Studies, with the author Omid Mehrgan and with Marlon Lieber. Omid works in the Department of Liberal Studies at NYU, and Marlon is currently at the Institute of English and American Studies at Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt. So the way that this is going to work is that I'm going to disappear in a second and hand over to Omid, who will begin by giving a presentation of the book, which will then be followed by a Q&A with Marlon. Okay, Omid, over to you.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you, Marlon, for being here. And I say hi to everyone who is watching now or later in the video. Before I start, this is going to be a very short presentation because I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with my colleague and friend, Marlon. But before that, I would like also to thank Sebastian Bajen and Historical Materialism book series editors who made this happen, this book. I just want to make 2 points. One is very general and the other is very specific. And I thought perhaps these two together can somehow perhaps open up some discussion or not, but just these to come to my mind, and both are somehow contextual or somehow circumstantial. One is related to the specific one, to the very order of the book, the structure of the book. You know, it's 4 chapters. Each deals with one book, one text by Heinrich von Kleist, Michael Kohlhaas. The first one. Second, Hegel's philosophy of right, elements of the philosophy of right. The third, Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And the last one is Adorno's aesthetic theory. So they somehow cover a century and a half between the French Revolution and the end of the Second World War. That's how I thought of it. And these 4 chapters, in each 4 movements take place the way I imagined it or tried to perform it. An autonomous aspect of the work is considered, then its social aspect, then the conflict between the two, and then the idea of a resolution, moving on to the next. That's really the 4, 4, 4, 4. I had this fantasy about the number of 4 working on this book, and we can talk about that later a little bit. To some extent corresponding to the idea of dialectics. But I mean, this book is based on this dissertation that I wrote in 2000, finished in 2018. So about 7 years has passed since the inception of the completion of the book. A lot has changed in the meantime. At that time, in the first form that it took, Adorno's chapter, Aesthetic Theory, was the first chapter. Now it's the last chapter. So it was Adorno, Kleist, Hegel, and Marx. That is, the book ended on politics. Now the book ends on aesthetic theory. This is, I thought a lot about this, and recently I sent the book to Jay Bernstein. He was so kind to give some comments about it. And he suggested, why didn't you put the Adorno's chapter at the beginning? I told him that was the idea originally. And the reason I gave is the following that I would like to offer here. Because I did not want the aesthetic theory to work as the original theory out of which these cases emerge. That would have defeated something in the book that I don't know quite what that is, but only that politics, art, literature are not examples of an aesthetic theory. That's one point that I would like to open up, and I'm very curious to know what Marlon thinks about that. Not that, Marlon, you have to go this path, but this was one consideration because I still think about it. The other is related to the really this long time that has passed since the completion of this book. And of course, the revision I did 4 years ago, the introduction, the first chapter, and the conclusion have substantially changed compared to the original plan. And in the meantime, a lot has happened. Environmental catastrophes, fascism, alt-right at a global level, and of course these massacres today in Gaza, the genocide. All this made me think about the very status and fate of critical theory. And I say that with capital C and T. You know? Kritische Theorie, that's how I was schooled in years ago. That's something that my generation responded to, learn from. For me, this book was a response to that tradition. For me, it was at the heart of European thought, and its key claim to be free, to have some autonomy, to be able to self-determine, to have oneself, to be in charge of oneself. This self can be anything, as I argued in the book. It can be a text, like that novella by Kleist. It can be person, human being, can be a thing like an artwork. And of course, a political project, the very basic claim of modern society, republic. We are not run by gods. We are not defined by kings, not by races. We are defined by ourselves, by the will of people. It's internal. All four have this claim about we are ourselves, or I am myself. Everything is showing us that this project had like drastic failures. And I argued in the book that it was almost impossible in a capitalist society, but not entirely impossible. And that was the little, like really narrow path that I called it, through a history, through a claim that is possible to, despite everything, to imagine or to conceive of a project that is not entirely heteronomous, not entirely out of one's hands. And of course, a host of problems come up here. What is control? Is it good to be in charge of oneself? Everything, because, well, and this takes me to the conclusion of these 2 points that I wanted to make. When I think about the book after these 7 years or 4 years, I think I still stand by all the premises and the main moves that I made in the book. But now I believe I have not drawn all the conclusions that I could have. And I see that as a shortcoming in the book. And I wonder why I did not. I think more can be drawn from some of the moves that are in the book. And the fact that I did not draw all the conclusions perhaps says something about the moves themselves. Perhaps the moves were not right. So I mean, it makes me think. For now, I would say this is my 2 points and a little conclusion. I really would like to hear from you, Marlon, and then I can say more, but down the road after I heard from you, if that's okay with you.
That sounds great. Yeah. Thanks so much for the introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. We actually met in person 10 years ago at a conference at Johns Hopkins. And then last year or the year before, I discovered by accident that your book was coming out with HM. And I was excited to see that. And now I had the pleasure of reading it. And I'm still excited about it, and I'm very happy to get to talk to you about this. And I'm also thankful to Alex for making this possible, and HM in general. So I think our listeners or viewers are probably interested in some of the specifics. And I thought you could maybe begin by elaborating on the concept of antinomy, because that's quite obviously quite a central notion for your book. And in the introduction, you introduce a new kind of antinomy, if I understood it correctly, that's your coinage basically, which you call a performative antinomy. And I think this is the concept that's very helpful, very generative for the project of critical theory. But maybe you could just basically begin by explaining what you mean by a performative antinomy and how it goes beyond the existing types of antinomy that we know from Kant and from others.
Thank you for that. That's helpful, Marlon, for my thinking here. Of course, the term antinomy first appears in Kant in this new sense. Today we understand it by perhaps similar to the concept of paradox, something that cannot sustain itself. But it's not just a logical paradox. Antinomy happens when we have two views on the phenomenon, on the subject matter. Each is true, sustainable on its own ground. You can say, yes, that makes sense. Yes, human beings are free. Of course, you can argue for that. Yes, there are these traditions, there are these texts, there are these positions, arguments leading to the fact that human beings are free. You have that and you're happy with that view. There's another view, however, saying the opposite, but equally compelling. These are the arguments, this is the path, these are the traditions showing that human beings are determined, that there is no free will, and many genetical sources you can name showing that what you do is already defined so that your act is just an effect. The fact that these two views are there and yet equally justifiable and yet in conflict with one another, Kant calls an antinomy. And he came up with 4 of them for different aspects: cosmology, psychology, ontology. And the idea was to show that metaphysical thinking in European tradition got entangled itself with these antinomies because the path was not correct. reason had all these, lofty ideas about the unconditional. And then if it had paid attention, it would have seen reason that you did not have to land in these contradictions. So antinomy is not really a big problem in modern philosophy. It's a problem that can be easily surpassed. Kant did it, Hegel did it, everyone just surpassed it easily. It's an obstacle that comes up, and you get into this double vision, really. It's an optical problem, really. You look at something from one aspect, you see how this is our artwork, all free, it has its own world, and then you go back, you see it in a gallery. So which one is it? Is it, the whole capital, the field of literature, everything? No, it's on its own. Both views are there, and both are justified, but they cannot live with each other. I called it performative because I did not want to, not that I did not want to, I argue that it cannot be resolved when it comes to these four cases of practice in which you want to create a free agency. Performative in the sense that you really enact both aspects of it. In the case of Marx, is the clearest idea, perhaps. You have a republic, you have a revolution, all people come to the street, they say, we want to have our own society, we do not want to be run by kings, we want free elections, constitution, we want votes and everything. And all classes can live together. Okay, this is one view. The other, it will emerge that, well, there is capital, there is landed property, all these lineages of, economic production going back decades are determining the acts of all these agents at this moment. So equality, constitution, the organic whole just falls apart. So which one? Should we just set aside political project of autonomy altogether, or should we just naively stick to that? No, it's possible under any conditions. So that's how I understand performative autonomy. Of course, the book itself makes it more clear. It's hard for me to reconstruct, Marlon, the entire double aspects of it, because really going through this, seeing this for oneself is part of the claim of Dugin. Go through this experiment of, seeing each aspect once, and then see that they do come into conflict, and there is no way around it. You cannot come with, like, as I said in the introduction, and I anticipate you will have something to say about that. I don't know why, but in the introduction, when I said all these genetic techniques that we have these days, culturalism, historicism, even critical race theory, gender, sexual difference, aspects, queer theory, disciplines or systems of knowing that are saying that acts of freedom are all rooted in acts of unfreedom, in conditions of unfreedom. And that's part of the main work of critical theory for our generation today. That's what it has done, right? And yet I say it's performative because we cannot do away with the other part, with the other side of antinomy, that is the naivety of the possibility of whatever, self-determination.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, of course, it's right, kind of very complicated conceptual labor that you perform, basically, and people would really need to read this, and they should read it. And I said I find it so kind of productive for critical theory because the way you set it up, right? The performative antinomy as a kind of a conflict between an act and its conditions of possibility, because I think it really like lends itself well to analyze uh, other instances of these antinomies. And I was reading it, I was thinking of a recent debate in Marxist theory about technology, automation, and all that. I mean, in another sense, a very old debate, but one that I think kind of came up again in the 2010s. And of course, we could have kind of the traditional Marxist understanding that you have the means of production, which are developed under capitalism, let's say. At some point, the relations of production, they become a fetter, right? That's the term that Marx uses in the introduction to the 1859 contribution to a critique of political economy. And then you have a social revolution, and afterwards, these material means of production, they can become the foundation of a new mode of production, right? And basically, the idea is, of course, once productive technologies are no longer needed to produce commodities, kind of under the aspect of exchange value in the service of capital accumulation, people could just kind of collectively, freely, right, autonomously, basically determine what to use these means of production for. But then you have some other people kind of pointing out that there's a possibility that specific purposes have already been inscribed materially really into these means of production, which Marx, right, would call the real subsumption of labor under capital, where specifically capitalist technologies are developed. And then, of course, right, this raises the question, can you really use all those technologies can you use them autonomously for other purposes, such as the production of use values, or will they not always be determined by heteronomous forces? And I think, right, this is something that your book and your discussion of the performative antinomy really kind of helped me to think through and maybe to, yeah, kind of to grasp conceptually. So I was very happy about that. This is why I think you can use this to think about other instances, right? You have the four aesthetic studies, as you call them, but this is really essentially, right, as you point out, it's about the problem of revolution, right? How can you create something new when you have to begin in existing preformed conditions? That's the essential problem, right? And I think that this is really it's helpful to think through this and to think through this predicament. And I think in your book, right, the aesthetic antinomy plays a central role. And at some point, you write, I wrote this down, that thinking of the aesthetic provides a model for engaging with the double constitution of any act forming itself autonomously. I think that's spot on, basically, and you show in the book that, right, there is something to it. But maybe also for everyone who's listening, who's watching this, who hasn't read the book, could you maybe explain what this aesthetic antinomy is? What, again, kind of this conflict between two forces is that plays out in the realm of the aesthetic? And then maybe you could, of course, also talk about Adorno's particular solution to it or way of thinking about it, and what you make of it in your book.
Yes, to the first point, that there are other cases, that's been something I've been thinking about ever since. One, that case about Marxist understandings of capitalist development or what will come out of it is very important, and it's perhaps really for us the main question in a sense. But I was also thinking of Freud, for example. Is it possible to think of the same double constitution of the like psyche? Is it like how to see it's performed there? There's something to be said about the first point, perhaps later on, because I want to return to this question of revolution inside, like within capitalism. It's a theme that is very debated inside Iran too, where I come from. But before that, the aesthetic, you know, it like aesthetics sounds like a place, like a model that is just, you know, remember the opening of Marcuse's aesthetic dimensions. He says a reality that in something like that. In a world where reality can be changed, must be changed only radically. Speaking of aesthetics, needs justification. I remember that. So he felt like he had to justify, as a Marxist revolutionary thinker, recourse to aesthetic theory. And in fact, for example, my advisor of those years, Hence de Vries, we had a lot of discussions about whether aesthetic is a model among other models, which that's his view. I thought it's not just one model, it's the model. That's why it's only in aesthetic that it really shows itself. What you this aesthetic antinomy, it shows itself anywhere that there is a claim to freedom, having to cope with its conditions of possibility. Perhaps it shows itself like in aesthetic most clearly. What I mean with that, an example is really just start with with any artwork. It is self-contained. This is something very modern, very European. I don't know, perhaps it is, perhaps others will say that in other traditions there is no notion of this self-contained artwork. European tradition has been obsessed with this self-contained artwork since Plato, right? Something that resembles life itself, like an organism. You can just look at the inside of this work to understand, to be animated by it, because it's as if it had soul in it, as if it had some movement in it. You know, like Van Gogh's Starry Nights, it's like as if it's moving. Today we have all these, you know, projections of Van Gogh's like paintings, like in New York, other places, like literally animating them on the wall with, you know, a lot of lights and movements. It does not need that. They're very, you know, it is moving. You don't have to literally move it on the screen. If that is the case, okay, you should look at this artwork until very recently, perhaps until the Second World War, I don't know. Until very recently, it was the main way of looking at works of art. But then immediately, especially Marxists come on stage to say, you are being deceived. You don't know what's going on behind. These are all forces. Production is underlying it. It's a field, like Bourdieu. A lot of, you know, signifying forces are making possible this contained frame. Don't be deceived by it. It's a production and effect of a whole world of domination. It's a case of a system. It's a work of an apparatus. In one word, it's not itself. Don't fall for it. I think it's a very powerful critical position or critical unmasking. It's very important, to the point that today aesthetics is all about activism. So it's an important aspect of it. Aesthetic activism, create arts for community, for organizing, for showing injustice. It's very, I'm not saying it rhetorically, Marlon. I'm just saying that this is an outcome, not least of this long genetical techniques in critique to unmask, to show that you are not yourself, you are defined by other forces. If you do not wake up about those forces, it means that you're ideological or you don't see the truth about the matter. In all other cases, it is basically true. It has taught us a lot. All these genetical techniques in contemporary critic, they have enriched our vision, our political vision. Do not fall for this, mediotic, discursive ways of deceptions, this manufacturing consent. I think that term is really captures it all. All forms of consent. Yes, politics in education, pedagogy. Yes. But when it comes to works of art, it's different. Because their whole claim is to appear. In other cases, appearance can be deceptive, appearances can be deceptive. Except in the case of works of art, their very claim is that I want to work with the deceptiveness of appearances. Because this is basically, as Lukács puts it, our everyday life optics. We watch things, we go around, we experience freedom in everyday life. So appearances are part of our fundamental experience. I have not mentioned this in the book, by the way, but now that you put it, I'm thinking of it now, that this is a conclusion you can draw from it. So being able to work with appearances is fundamental for a revolutionary subject. Aesthetic antinomy is that the appearance says something, and the conditions of the possibility of the appearance, that is the gallery in which the artwork presents, or any other institution. It can be a Sackler wing, Sackler family, just imagine the connections to the worst aspects of practices of injustice in this society. It cannot get any worse. Capitalism, drug company, everything, ideology, all are coalescing in this one wing. And yet your work is there. So the artwork responds to this very predicament, is the main point in my reading of Adorno's aesthetic theory. It is not indifferent to this duality. It's not dumb. It's not like, yes, I just want to show you that I appear this way, and I just close my eyes to my conditions of possibility, and I show to you that there is freedom and there is sublime and there is, all that. It's a bad artwork. That's an artwork that is not an artwork, because it's blind to its. In fact, it's blind to what contemporary critic is teaching us. That there are conditions. There are conditions like the fetters, like all this. We get to that point, but all these chains, that there are real conditions really restraining your claims to good things, to big things, being revolution, being love, being, anything, being free Palestine, whatever. It's just there's real conditions straining you. But the artwork, it shows it, responds to it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was wondering because I think you kind of implied that there can be works of art that are not really works of art. And in your book, I think at one point you quote Adorno writing about the de-aestheticization of art, or the Entkunstung der Kunst, this possibility that maybe if art does not internalize this antinomy and kind of integrate it into its own formal logic, basically, that it somehow it fails to do what art in this emphatic understanding is meant to do. And I was generally wondering, because when you talk about specific works of art in your book, they're mostly like pre-Adorno or pre-1960s. So there's Kleist, obviously. There's a section on Beethoven. There's Kafka makes an appearance every once in a while. William Carlos Williams, Virginia Woolf. So many modernists, like people like Adorno, might also be into. But I was really wondering because, of course, with Adorno writing the aesthetic theory, basically before his death, not being able to finish it. It's published in 1970, and then afterwards, one way of looking at the history of art would, of course, be to speak about the, I don't know, succession of modernism by postmodernism. And I was wondering if you, like, if there would be any more recent works of art that you think also kind of integrate and sustain this conflict, or whether it's more generally uh, the case that art does not live up to its concept, as it were, anymore. Whether this has changed lately, I don't know.
You're saying if you're asking if there are, I think there are works that I have
Well, basically more recent ones.
after, yes. You're right that all these works, I think all of them. When did Carlos Williams wrote that poem? It was before the war, I guess, no?
I think
Because all these were, you are right, before like the whole post-war changed landscape. Adorno himself, apart from Beckett, also deals with works. Well, let's set that aside. You know what, Marlon? I was really thinking about jazz, and it's a very tricky place to. I know you're an Americanist in a sense too, so this is perhaps an interesting place. America is a place of this. I argued in the book that Adorno understood this antinomy, this double character in America, in his American experience. Before that, it was more like a good old European, nagger about heteronomy. When he went to America, understood that it's not just about regression in hearing and then it's reified hearing and there are good artworks. It starts saying that it's both. So aesthetic theory is really a departure from the culture industry chapter. It's a departure from philosophy of modern music. Even though I have not read that book well enough, I have not studied that book, but you do see antinomy there. He saw something about that, but it was in America. He saw both. And jazz is that wound, I would say, in critical theory that really we can return to. And I think examples of contemporary understanding of this, responding to this double character that I identified as critical in a good work of a successful work of art. Well, it's like a good work of art, a true work of art can be found perhaps there. Before getting there, the example that he refers to is late Wagner, lofty sounds, lofty spectacles that he calls shine, is in a more modern sense, not just appearances of elevation. I think Hollywood really adopted Wagner, or Broadway too, like internalized that kind of spectacle. It is bad because it's bad faith. It's like you are in swamp, but you talk as if you are not. Well, if you can talk, if you are really in a swamp and speak, well, that's an interesting appearance, and so it's possible. But it's a form of bad faith because you are constrained, but you do not, or you have possibilities, but you do not address them. I think of the concept of bad faith for a bad work of art. At some point, he says a bad work of art is worse than existence. I mean, it does not have to exist. It's an affront. Well, I think a lot about this statement, what he means by worse than existence. Other things in the world at least are one with their conditions, but you lie about how you exist, and you give bad you misinform about conditions of living in this world, and that's not a good thing. It's disinformation about ecologies of living. A bad artwork does that. That's why it's deceptive in a bad sense. He thought jazz did it. It's a bit brutal, and many have taken issue with that. Some say that he was just looking at that, period of big bang jazz, big band jazz, Count Basie and like early Armstrong and like even Duke Ellington and others. I don't know, did he like listen to bebop, like to that?
I think at some point it's been a while since I read something about this, but I think when they were living in New York before they moved to Los Angeles, I think Adorno and Horkheimer they used to visit some clubs and they might have heard bebop, but I'm not really sure. I think at least one of his essays on jazz is later. I don't remember this well enough whether he talks about this explicitly. But I think you said something important about Adorno and his maybe the connection between also the culture industry chapter and the aesthetic theory, because I think the culture industry chapter, right, it's often read as this kind of elitist account where Adorno and Horkheimer basically say all those people, they're dumb, they allow themselves to get manipulated. I think that's not really the point. I think the chapter is titled Enlightenment as Mass Deception, and I think they claim, right, there is the works that they talk about, they enter the scene as aesthetic objects, which is why they demand to be taken seriously, but then they are not actually serious. Right? That's kind of, I think, what you called bad faith. They are aesthetic objects. They should be like formed embodiments of some, I don't know, some kind of truth or something at least. And I think their critique is not that there is mass culture, but their critique is that mass culture does not live up to what an aesthetic object should be, I think, right? It's not these eggheads basically looking down at people. I mean, maybe some of that too, but I think that's not the main problem. It's really a case of bad faith, as you call it, I think.
Or to add to what you said, these objects also found themselves in mass culture. So it has become difficult. They open their eyes, they are inside these institutions. I don't know who said that, but even Heidegger saw it, right? In the early, I think it's in the first page of Origin of Urspring of a work of art. He says, look, these Beethoven records, it's like in potato sacks. He saw it. He was sensitive to it. I mean, it's interesting, but he did not I think he didn't take it seriously enough, or he was perhaps too disappointed with the word of technological word. I don't know. Perhaps Heidegger was too removed. Something about it did not land in an antinomy. For Adorno, it did. Because he saw that it's both. It's Beethoven in records. It's Beethoven piped through restaurants. But it remains Beethoven, and it finds it's there. He shouldn't be afraid. I think maybe it was like him. So he had a very childish character. Apparently, they say that He had a very beautiful childhood, pastoral, living with two singers, aunt and mother, and then the new world and fascism and then Holocaust and everything. I think I don't like, I mean, he argues against psychologizing readings, and I'm not doing that, but it gives a sense of finding oneself in the chaotic world of hard conditions of life. Like a good Marxist can be able to educate working class kids. See, these conditions are real. They devour you, they crush you if you don't pay attention, if you don't get organized. In such a world, works are what, as you put it, aesthetic objects, objects that you can sense. It's very important. You hear them, look at them. I don't know about the smell. Look at them, hear them. That's aesthetic. That's how we understand aesthetic. But not like culinary that you just, it's personal. Things that you can look at, listen, but you can invite others to look at too. It's very interesting. You invite, it's socially interesting, as Kant says, these aesthetic objects. You bring them, you say, look how good this work is. This is political. It's not just, I just eat it, it's just for me, it's my own personal sense. So it's not sensual only, it's aesthetic. That is both my and universal, everyone.
Yeah. And yeah, now, I think the reading of Beethoven in your book, even if it's only a couple of pages, I think, but really nicely, I think, explains, also explains to me, right? I mean, Adorno's aesthetic theory is kind of infamously difficult. And then for someone who's not musicologically trained, his writings about music might be even more difficult. But when you write about encountering Beethoven's Tempest Sonata in a cafe, and you explain what it means maybe to isolate some elements that you might enjoy in this almost culinary fashion, a certain melody, in contrast to kind of grasping their place in the movement of the entire thing, right? As you said earlier, the work is not static. It's a process. It's in movement. I think this helped me really to also to better understand Adorno and what it means to look at works of art the way Adorno did. I think that this was great.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear. That time Marlon, I really took pains to understand just what is F major, what does phrase mean, and since I really started like reading music theory in the past years, that's why I really do want to revisit some aspects of this in relation to bebop in particular, because it does certain things that, well, I have not really studied, like you said, his later jazz work, jazz essays either, but I think it's important to do this double movement, isolation, and then putting back. It helped me to get a sense of what he's doing too. And also, again, I return to this genetic techniques that I keep referring to, because it's really suffocating today in terms of you are just left. Well, we can talk about it perhaps later bit later on when we get to politics, as I hope we will. But this culturalism or socialism even can jeopardize the important acts of isolation when we find these objects in the real world. That's what I wanted to say.
I mean, there's no time like the present, right? We can talk about politics if you want to.
Okay.
Because you brought it up, and I think that is there's a couple of ways we could do this, right? So that there's the chapter in the book that's about the political antinomy of the Republic, which you already addressed earlier, or um, we could again kind of return to the contemporary situation, right? You mentioned in the beginning that uh, it's been a while since you initially wrote the dissertation that became this book. In the book, you mentioned catastrophic climate change, and now you've mentioned that, right, there's also the reemergence of fascism, there's an ongoing genocide. And it seemed to me like you were struggling with the maybe the affordances of still doing this work. But um, yeah, how would you um, maybe now, a couple of years after you initially wrote this, given the contemporary conjuncture, basically, um, what would you do differently, right? I think in the beginning, in your introductory comments, you said that there are a couple of things you might do differently, a couple of things that you did not address in the book, but that you might want to. Um, what would these be?
Yes. Um, this is a bit general, so it's a bit difficult to answer, but I can specify it in this way. You know, you mentioned the contemporary discussions about capitalism and the prospect, whether there is a way out because forces are already there, and there is something in the situation that can lead to a break with the situation, and then others say that it is so set that there is no way out. Am I reconstructing what you said
Um,
or no? What do you
I
think?
think generally, yeah. I think I mean, on the one hand, I was specifically talking about this whole debate about technology, for instance,
Technology, yes,
right,
yes.
the one between Alberto Toscano and Jasper Burns about logistics, who I think, which nicely kind of encapsulated these positions, basically. One saying these technologies that they might be reconfigured or repurposed. And Jasper Burns basically making this point that I referred to earlier, basically saying some technologies they might exist only for the purpose of, for instance, better exploiting the working class. So it's almost impossible to see how they could be reconfigured, right? So that the conditions in which these technologies have been produced, they allow no kind of self-determined use of these. They only exist for the purpose of valorizing value, basically, accumulating capital. This was the more specific point about technology, but of course, more generally, right, the one about revolution really is revolution is supposed to be a rupture, right? After it, in some sense, everything should be different, right? Um, uh, but on the other hand, it's right existing people who have to make the revolution in existing conditions, and they would presumably be still around after the revolution. So the question is, of course, really how would people and institutions and everything basically that has emerged in a world shaped by the forces of capital, how could you break with this? This is the problem, right? And I think yeah, I read your book as basically suggesting that thinking about aesthetics is one way to think about the same problem. How can a work be autonomous? How can it kind of organize its internal elements according to its own logic when all these elements, right, whether it's sounds or images or plots or words or whatever, when all these materials basically emerge in a pre-existing world. Um, but so yeah, right. It's the problem, right? How can an act institute something new when it is an act in a world that already exists in a certain way, basically.
The way you put it, it just makes me think, you know. For example, this debate about, imagine you know what the essence of technology is, right? Or the essence of this new technology, like AI is something apparently fundamentally different, and others will say perhaps not. It's just enhanced Google search. Others say, no, it's something different, consciousness, whatnot. Okay. I think on the one hand, it's related to the question of nature. It's very aesthetic in a sense, because I think AI is replacing nature because we are done with nature. It has destroyed, so we want to have nature again because it feels natural. AI, it's independent. It does its own thing. It feels like a background ontology. It feels like a new beginning in that sense, a new like fundamental plain ground. It does lead to the idea that perhaps you can do better things with it than than what than what it's doing now. Particularly finding targets to kill, they are better. For example, others say the way this is appearing to you is so abysmally conditioned already. First of all, every act of AI takes a lot of water. You have to cool down these big buildings. So already it's just further destroying nature in a sense. So I would side with those who are a bit more pessimistic, because it's important to take side with any account of Genesis today. I think it's politically important to remind people that there are conditions. I think it's important. But on the other hand, we don't know what technology really does. It's being debated, you know, even in the period I'm interested in, and you're interested in, like even between Benjamin, Adorno, Heidegger, a lot of discussion. It's not clear what the technology for Benjamin. There is hope. Cinema, everything, things can appear. For many people, maybe this is something entirely new. I'm not saying, like others saying, that every generation has its own, qualms about their contemporary. No, maybe some generations are, maybe some ages are fundamentally different. Who knows? Have you seen whole history? You don't know. Maybe today is something like ontologically different in terms of novum, technological novelty. Maybe it's something else that we need to. So I would say, again, antinomic way is better to keep both alive. But politically, it means, what does it mean? How does it do to the subject? What do I do when I want to get organized? Right? Should I postpone getting organized to after I understood what is the genesis of the present? Or can I ever know that? I put it that way because in the chapter on Marx, I put it this way. Revolutionists come to the streets, say, this is republic, this is a new beginning, we are now all together. The initial February 1840 euphoria. It reminds me of like Iranian Revolution, 1970. It was a huge break. Huge. It was, no one thought that, the Shah's regime was called the apparatus, dastgah. It was so established. Touched with the US, touched with Israel. It was established world with a lot of oil's money. But it collapsed. It was a new beginning. And all these different parties came. The first 2 years after Iranian Revolution was really rupture. But then conditions starting showing themselves. Like you said, those purposes set, or those tendencies embedded, starting to, emerging. So today, many subjects, no new beginning. But what would you do at that moment? We know that there are structures in place. When we go in streets like anything, any little union organizing, we know, like especially, I don't know, Marxists know that there are structures there, and yet they perform the political act. What is this? I think antinomy takes place somewhere there. I don't know. Traditionally, they call it theory, practice, whatever, dialectics. For a while, the party was to play out, enact this move with dialectics, and still it can, if you can have access to any collective, because it's so difficult to get together, you know, it's so difficult, it's so fragmenting, everything's fragmented. It's the, you know, contemporary political world is very fragmented. This is something that everyone is complaining about. Media has contributed to that. Actual, you know, forces are contributing to that. But Marx, I don't think ever in the 18 Brumaire said that, or even later, that you are naive, don't go out because you haven't I don't know. I'm a bit, that's one place that I'm not really a step further. I don't know. But I just know that it's antinomy somewhere there. It's like this knowledge of structures, and yet this political act which is different. It has a different form. Antinomy takes place exactly there. I don't know. What do you think? I'm always a bit stuck there.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, right, this is a problem that cannot be solved theoretically or aesthetically, but as you're right, it's ultimately it's a problem that will have been solved or not by practice. But I think what you mentioned earlier and also mentioned in the conclusion to your book, right, the Anthropocene, catastrophic climate change, this really complicates matters even more, right? Because if you talk about conditions, if you talk about basically the amount of future heating, the amount of sea level rise that's kind of already locked in, it seems much more difficult to imagine, right, to engaging in an autonomous act when conditions are not just right the repressive and ideological state apparatuses, right, however you want to call it, but when it's really basically natural processes that have been triggered basically, and we don't know how they are going to play out. We don't know how the conditions that have been created by some 200 years of fossil fuel burning, how they will influence the future. So it seems there will be more, I don't know, inertia. The conditions will be even harder to somehow to break with, or however you want to call it. But I think, right, still in the end, if we give up on the idea that an autonomous political act is possible, well then, right, as you write in the book, we could do the Heidegger thing and say only God can save us. But that's not really a desirable alternative, right?
Um, you know, in one sense, Marlon, I was thinking in one sense, the idea of God is a bit helpful. You know, Hegel called God the most useful idea. This is nützlichste Idee. And I think maybe one of its uses is today. Why? This is one of the things I could have and want. Now I wish I had developed, but I'm working on it now. This changing image of nature after in the Anthropocene, or in quotation marks or not. Doesn't matter, capitalism, doesn't matter what's the agency is that it created it, but the very fundamental notion of nature as that which grows naturally. You know? This is a European idea, that's nature. Not true, it just grows by itself. Fusée, it just grows. You do not touch it, you do not manufacture it. This has changed though, because it looks like you say, fundamental natural processes, you called it. That is changing. Geologists are saying that is changing. And that is been affected by capital or human beings, right? Whatever. A class, bourgeois, Europeans, right? That means that the idea of nature must change. So art cannot mimic the natural anymore because there is nothing, in a sense, there's nothing evidently natural there or immediately natural there. You look at the landscape, you say, oh, it can be affect. Is it because of climate change? Why there is more rain today? Is it, it's paranoia. There's this paranoia that you don't know. So it's the basic, like, perceptions are being affected by something very abstract. Climate change. In this paper I'm working on as a continuation, the problem is abstract. It's very hard to tell people what it is. You have to say, oh, like 100 papers have been published in the Anthropocene journals, all these. If you read these papers I did for this paper I'm writing, it's very difficult and it's all aesthetic. You have to look at these layers of deposits over years, and you go to a place, it's very like a painting. This layer is like natural, this is composite, this is like trash from industrial age. Strange. And then they merge into one another to the point that some are saying, some scientists or some thinkers of Anthropocene, more in the earth systems, that in future, hundreds years from now, I don't know, 500 from now, it may not be possible to tell apart natural deposits from anthropogenic deposits.
Yeah. I think that's kind of an intriguing idea, right? You said that if the work of art always, in a specific way, modeled itself on nature, right? Or you speak about natural beauty in the book, as Adorno does, going back to Kant, I think again. But yeah, can we think about nature differently, and can we think about nature still in the same way? And what does that do to our understanding of the work of art and its relationship to natural beauty? The category of the sublime plays a role in your book, and I was often wondering, right, if the kind of the sublime says something about nature, or one version of the sublime says there is something about nature that is so terrifying that it threatens to destroy the subject. But at the same time, if we observe it from a position of safety, our soul is elevated. What happens if the disposition of safety can no longer be imagined, right? What does that do to the concept of the sublime? Is it still possible if you can no longer imagine yourself living in some place where you are actually kind of protected from nature, a nature changed kind of irrevocably by human activity? I think that's interesting. This whole problematic, I think.
It's a beautiful question, the way you put it. That's it. I think that's the heart of the matter, really. It's very fundamental. It's hard to render that political, though, discursively. But I think this is the question. Because maybe some of these discussions about, capitalism in the web, who's the philosopher, who's the thinker
There's
who
no
wrote?
more?
So,
Capital,
yes,
yeah, more.
yeah, more, and others who are this. It's interesting debate. Even though, like, on the other hand, Dana Haraway and others, there's one thing, maybe it's the place to mention that after the way you put that question. One thing that is slightly worrisome is that contemporary critical thinkers are a bit too quick finding a solution. It's like Haraway is saying, look at nature, we are there, and many. We are part of nature. No, we are alienated. European history has alienated everything. There's no reconciliation without truth, so to speak, if you use the language of, apartheid in South Africa. I'm not sure the alienating effects of the entire process can make it easy to come up with notions of we have always been part of this. What is interesting in Moore's idea is that, and I touched on it in Marx chapter about the organic form of capital, where I would put it this way today. It looks like that capital has become natural, or so naturalized that it's quite natural. It's more natural today than than landscapes. What if it is a surplus force? It's the idea in the heads of everyone that of course profit. It's just fundamental, you know. It's so natural. But on the other hand, cannot be too quick. Don't know. I mean, this is where I like Adorno's pessimism. Is the capitalist exchange has done something really wrong to everything, down to this genocide. It cannot just be let's move on. So this, in the debate, to return to that point of yours, those who are a bit too excited about technology, I would say, you know, this technology that is given to this luxury communism, as one author said, is it's rooted in, you know, liters and liters of water, all right? And for generations, we don't even know what will come because the conditions, like you said, are yet to show themselves. So we do not even know the genesis of this, let alone the outcomes. So I would say we should, even when it comes to the question of sublime, perhaps be a bit more terrified for the moment than to be a bit more reconciliatory, which I don't know, the Christian mentality a bit in the European sense wants it just to feel good all of a sudden and then just embrace new nature and then going to spiders and then to jungles. No, no, it is not. I don't think any path there.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
right. Yeah. This
yeah, go
would
ahead.
another case for thinking dialectically, thinking about antinomies and not about quick resolutions, right? Whether it's in the case of nature or our new understanding of nature, or whether it's in the case of technology or whatever, right? In the end, the maybe the difficulty would be to be able to sustain the antinomy, right? Without giving into the temptation to go for the quick resolution. And I, yeah, I think it's again maybe Adorno, for all his alleged pessimism, is good because right, he at least he still is able to look at works of art and think about the possibility of um, maybe the potential for reconciliation, or I mean, one term that you use is participation in your book.
Yes.
Or what Adorno and Horkheimer use in the dialectic of enlightenment, this idea of Eingedenken, which I don't know how it's usually, there's not really, I think, a good way to translate it. But was it translated, how is it translated? Like the remembrance of nature. Um, it's not a resolution in practice or a reconciliation in practice, but it's a way of maybe thinking about the possibility for or of reconciliation while still being able to sustain the antinomy in thought, or perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good place to start, perhaps moving towards an ending, because I'm glad you brought it up. The image of reconciliation, or the thought of it. The fact that it is there somewhere, somewhere, despite the required pedagogy of looking at conditions of living. The fact that it's there, is it does that mean that it denotes a possibility? Perhaps it's a metaphysical question. The fact that there is an idea, there is that image, does this mean that it's not just in my head? Because a thing in this world has shown it on its body, a work of art. Look at it and it has been able to see problems in its composition, You start with dang, dang, you start with C major, whatever chord, and then you have to find a way, and you see all these little problems that come up. And the more honest the work is, the more fearless it is. It goes to the heart of these problems, everything that is there. Worst case scenarios, looks at them and then propose little ways around them. Like in a sense, it's like a plant. It finds its way towards the sun. If there's a stone, a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit, if it's less water, then finds its way. And of course, it has to deal with the fact that there's monoxide, that there is all these, eternal chemicals, whatever conditions. The image of finding a way, perhaps it speaks to us today, perhaps because everything else, I don't know how you see it, Marlon, but this is something that many are saying, and I sense it too. All these institutions, basic discourses are in deep crisis after the Gaza genocide, because very basic things are not being said or suppressed, or especially in the symbolic order of like Western world, right? It's the world of discourses. It's the world of universal. Because it appears to be crumbling. You would think what is one thing that can link people even? So God is one of them, really, it's an idea. I'm saying that as an observer, not as a believer. But I don't see any problem with belief too, because it's so faithful, it's so you look at the abyss of Gaza, and then you ask all these questions, everything comes up. Everything comes up. I don't know, all these things come up. How does life emerge again from this? Is it even, what if other communities, what if the very conditions of intelligibility are being attacked, And it's directly related to Anthropocene, because in Anthropocene it's about seeing too. There are some good works recently on that, seeing. You are asking people to look at the same landscapes of the same everyday life, and you're telling them, you see, this is caused by people somewhere. What does that mean? How to, it's very strange. Until you see factories on your land that are polluting your water, it's very hard to see that. And now, I don't know, some are saying, like Andreas Malm, others, that like the bombs in Gaza are directly contributing to the climate change, and it's just one effect of it. I think even if the emissions are not that high, the pollution in the Greek sense of the like sense of Sophocles, miasma is there. Something is polluted, like globally. And I think the question of image, the way you put it, the possibility of a different praxis that Adorno mentions, this has a different timbre today. This I would have changed or address a bit more urgently in the book.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can do so in your next book, I guess, or the next article. All right. Yeah, I think we could conclude our discussion unless I don't know, is there something uh that about your book that you'd like to return to, or um should we
Uh,
end with the idea that there has to be the image somewhere?
I have to say, Marlon, you are such a good reader. It's a joy to. It's very rare. So I can't bring many things. You mentioned different things in recesses of the book that usually I'm surprised. Not at you, but to be heard to hear it after all these years that these were only in my mind the book because. So that in itself entices me to want to talk more, but uh, not really. We can go on, but nothing specific comes to my mind unless you want to say something. But I do want to continue our conversations in other
Absolutely. Yeah.
setting.
Yeah. No, I a couple of things I thought about. They're really they address completely different aspects, and they're not very important now. No, it was a pleasure talking to you. It was a pleasure reading your book, getting to read your book, and I will return to it. I think it's definitely it's as I said, I think it's incredibly helpful in thinking through some of these kind of antinomic structures that we encounter again and again in different walks of life, basically. So yeah, this was great. This was great fun.
Thank
Uh,
you very much, Marlon. And I asked you to come here. I found you, and it was thanks for agreeing to read and participate in this. And I hope we can, yes, talk again later. Okay.
yeah,
And Alex and others at HM2 for making this happen.
yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone listening or watching. We don't because we're on Zoom. We don't know how
No,
many
no.
people listen. No, this was
Future
great.
listeners.
And yeah, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Bye.
Take care.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much.